let me move through a little bit and talk about one of the opportunities with OMChats that I find really unique as a company. As an industry partner, they've got this opportunity online. You'll see some information at the end of the presentation where you can join in on some of these chats, and it's just a great way for other professionals to have conversations about design. So I encourage you to check that out. Well, let's keep going along through then. One of the things we're going to do today is we're going to be talking a little bit more about the process of movement at work and how that goes down and what that's for and what that does. That'll be really important. So I'm having a little bit of trouble advancing slides, but we'll keep trying to get through. There we go. There's a response. So the challenge that we've got that we're facing now is how do we get people to move more at work? We will talk about that at length. We'll talk about also ways to, on an individual basis for you personally. So you may have a role in corporate. You may have a role as an ergonomist or a safety person, as a designer, architect, interior decorator. You may be someone who just yourself personally wants to be able to figure out how to get a little bit more movement built in. So we'll talk about that and some of the benefits, some of the pros and cons of different approaches, and sort of how you can move through those things. I guess the first big thing to consider is, is movement at work good for us? And so I guess this is the easy place to talk about not moving as sedentary behavior and what's happened to us the last 50 years, especially as we've moved more than 2/3, close to 3/4 now of our workforce in the U.S. is office-based, technology-based. And unfortunately, the things that are associated with sedentary behavior, not moving, are things like type 2 diabetes and obesity and cardiovascular disease. We're seeing shortening of our life expectancy. Unfortunately, this is the 3rd year in a row we've had a decrease in the U.S. life expectancy. Big chunk of that is tied to the opioid epidemic, but unfortunately there's also a part of it that's connected to obesity and poorer health in general and not moving. So I think that this is becoming a really obvious part of our dialogue with our healthcare professionals, with folks in the wellness and fitness arena. So it's kind of incumbent upon us all to figure out how to get us back to some of that healthy movement. So we'll talk about what healthy movement looks like. Probably the biggest message is that it's not one thing. It is a multiple different groups of activities throughout the day that we need to be truly healthy. So we'll go into that a little bit. We're also going to be talking about prompting, and what I mean by that is different ways for either technology or people to help one another and prompt them to move more, to change positions, to have different postures. And so we'll look at different things about taking breaks and the impacts of those, and we'll look at the impacts on productivity. We will also be looking at some of the newest research that we've got out on footrest and foot rails. We will talk quite a bit about what is that kind of magic number, and there's a lot of discussions, a lot of conversations, a lot of debates within the research community about the amount of time before you change from a static posture of either static standing or static sitting, whatever it happens to be. When should you move? How often should you move? So we'll take a look at that, see what the research says. Finally, the bottom line message, of course, is that we need to move more and be still less. We're not moving enough. But we will look at the cognitive impacts from some of the recent studies where we've got objective data around cognition and what those types of impacts would be, because we're always concerned about that with workers that are producing, that are creating. We want them to be as productive at work and as helpful at work as we possibly can get them. So very important. So let's take a look at one of the first groupings of studies that we've done over the last couple of years here at Texas A&M. And when I say here at Texas A&M, I mean our researchers, but of course, this group of slides comes from California, Houston, 600 workers in Australia at 3 different locations. So about 1,600 folks included in these pie charts, if you will. And what we were looking at was over a 6-month period of time, monitoring them every minute of every day and how active they were on their computers, and whether or not they were sitting or standing at their electric sit-stand desk. So we talk in general terms about sit and stand. I prefer the term stand capable for these workstations today just because there's such a variety out there. We have workstations that are always up at a standing height. We call those stand biased. We have workstations that are, for instance, electric, and they can push a button and move from a seated position to a standing position. We also have units on top of desks now, and those units can go from a seated to a standing position. Some are manual, some of those are electric. And so whether it's a sit-to-stand type of station or a stand-by station, they're all stand-capable, and so we tend to kind of group those. But these, for the pie charts you're looking at, were all some sort of an electric sit-to-stand desk. And for those folks that were using those before, they were spending about 90% of their time seated. And so if you look at that 10% of the time for that group that they were spending standing, it's really hovered in heavily on a very small group of people. So a lot more than 90% of the people, were struggling to get any kind of movement at all once they got to work and kind of got seated. So we did see some changes. After 6 months, we started prompting them and giving them some nudges through the computer software. And with those nudges, we did see a change, almost a doubling overall for the bigger group, which is notable, going from 10% to probably about 18% there. It was a positive from that standpoint, but we have to kind of ask the question, and I hope some of you are thinking of this, so does this matter? Does this matter for health? Does it matter for productivity? And we've got some slides coming up that'll address both of those. If you dig a little deeper into those two pie charts, you can see that the folks at baseline before the prompting who had just one desk position change per workday, they did improve to 2 desk position changes on average per workday. So that's across the averages. But if you really start looking at people who use these products quite frequently, so we looked at that as people who changed from seated to standing at least 3 times, greater than 3 times a day. That went from 10% of the work population to almost half, 43%. So that was a dramatic improvement in the utilization of these products. So keep in mind, everyone at these companies has one of these desks. This isn't by selection. This is all of the workers in these buildings have these electric desks. But many of them before the prompting and the software were not using the desks. And you can see afterwards, a lot of the people were using them a lot more, and a lot more of the people were using them what I would consider significantly to have an impact on their health or their productivity. If you take a look at the next little graphic there, 20% of workers never used it. That went down to 4%. So that's, again, really noteworthy that, you had a fifth of the workforce who had a product that they never took advantage of, and then you were able to reduce that to 4%. So that's a significant improvement. You can see that there in the effect sizes. Moving along, in general, when we think about 24 hours, which is really how we should be looking at all of this, we shouldn't just look at the workday, although it's easier for researchers like us at Texas A&M to just look at the workday because we have a captive audience. We kind of have a license to study, permission to study, if you will, at the office. So it makes it a little bit trickier to have folks go home with wearable sensors and different types of monitors. But you can tell from the general U.S. trends that folks are moving less than 3 hours a day. And when you think about what that means, that is all of the movement activity that we would categorize in the light or the moderate or the vigorous, kind of the exercise level activity. So whether it's just a little bit of ambulation, a little bit of movement, or whether it's kind of that whole body, walking, swimming, bicycling, jogging, it's really only about 12% of the 24-hour day. The other 88% were sedentary. And this, of course, is a dramatic change really in the last 50 years, but certainly if you go back hundreds of years, tremendous, unprecedented changes. And unfortunately, we're seeing that now, the toll, the health effect on our bodies. And so we've got to work to change that. So how about these standing desks or stand-capable desks and the attention deficit hyperactive disorder sufferers? What do we see with the folks that have these conditions? We are noting that they are having better transitions. It's a little bit easier on and off. Some of the old information that's out there about the safety of stools is really misguided. Most of the research that's been done around that has been done around good quality, well-designed stools with glides rather than casters. People get on and off of those very safely. They make that transition as well or better than they do from a chair with casters. So if you take a look at any bar in America that has stools, I can assure you they wouldn't be there around people who are drinking if they weren't safe to use. So we can kind of put that one to rest. But the other issue that we have is that folks are using medications for ADHD, and so this is a way to help intervene to reduce either the amount or eliminate completely the medications. We also see some behavioral issues, particularly for younger kids in classrooms, with focus and attention. And so giving them the ability to dial in and connect and focus has been a real positive of these stand-capable workstations, particularly in a classroom. So any type of activity-permissive learning environment has been a positive for teachers. This trend has picked up around the world, and it's really taken off. We were involved in some research that resulted in some school desk designs that have now reached millions of children, all 50 U.S. states and over 30 countries. And so I think that the kids are taking to this faster and more naturally even than those of us that picked up on the trend years back in the office. And that's great because one day all of those children will be our future office workers. And so it's great that they're getting that exposure and learning how to have that whole body movement at a younger age. That'll help them tremendously. If you take a look at the next slide, the kind of the point here is that we have sort of had a debate the last decade or so about sit versus stand, and I really think that whole conversation has been kind of off target. In other words, it's really not about sit versus stand, it's sit and stand, yes, move, change, right? Our best seated position, our best working position for especially information age workers, we're talking about office workers, is our next position. So it's critical that we allow people to build in movement. So whether that's tilt, pivot, rock, lean, swivel, honestly, I don't care if it's shake, rattle, and roll, the answer is yes, right? We need more of that built into our day. We need more of those types of activities. All those things increase blood flow, they produce better reaction, better alertness, better respiration, and we need all of that to heal our bodies that are so exposed to this sedentary behavior constantly. Taking a look at the next discussion there, we want to be able to prompt people through these devices, through the computer software, et cetera, appropriately. So one of the ways to do that is to be more intelligent with our prompting. What's happening right now, the trend is that we are moving towards more of an intelligent electronic coach. And the cool thing about that is we get to sense your presence at the workstation. We get to tell what position your workstation's in. We get to tell what position you are in. We can tell how much time you spend on the computer on certain tasks. We can even tell from the intonation in your voice whether you're getting excited and talking fast or whether you're kind of slowing it down and you're getting a little tired and fatigued. We can prompt you accordingly, not just for what is happening with you at the time, but based on your personal history of what you need and how you will best respond. Some of us might really need a kind of gruff and grumbly voice griping at us to get us going, you know, hey, get going. Somebody else might need a more loving and pleasant voice coming on and gently encouraging us to take on these other behaviors that would be either more healthful or more productive at the time. I know for me that's probably about an hour after lunch when I really need somebody to probably yell at me and get me going because I'm getting a little drowsy. So it's really important that we figure out those custom prompts to help people to do this throughout the day. And of course, this isn't just going to be at work. This will be throughout their entire day. We also need to design the building and the space around it for more movement and exercise. This is really critical, and we can do this many different ways. Some simple ones, of course, would be, you know, walking meetings and conference tables where you can have a discussion, you know, standing. We might be able to put in some different types of keyboarding and look at ways to do things that help with the error rates, and we'll talk about a little bit of those when we get to the productivity section on the different types of stand-capable workstations. So if you take a look at the bars here, this is kind of exciting. This is something we haven't released to the public yet, but we wanted to share that for the first time in this webinar, and that is that this is about 10,000 workers measured every day over the course of a year, and the people that you see in the green bar had the sit-stand workstations. The people in the gray bar had the traditional seated workstations. Same company, all kinds of mixtures of jobs and locations, but about 10,000 workers over a year. And what you're picking up on is that the total amount of time they spent working at the computer was greater. Now, if that's productivity, we'll take it. We're not sure what that means to some companies, but for most of the companies that we're working with, when they see greater output, more words typed, more time spent mousing, keying, etc., they consider that productivity. And so wondering about some of those other metrics, we have about 120 of those. I'm sure everyone on the call will be glad to know I'm only going to share a few of them with you for sake of time, but we have about 120 of those different metrics, and they're really important to understand kind of output. And so when you see metrics like these where the folks that are at these stand-capable workstations are able to output more mouse clicks per day, they're able to move their mouse through more pixels on the screen per day over the course of whether it's a month or measured at a year. I think that's also an important point from a research perspective. If you'll notice the bar charts for the 1 month, that's 30 days of data, the first 30 days of the data, and then for the whole year, so all 12 months, they're basically the same. And why that's important to researchers is that we can go in and study a population for a month and feel confident that we got it, right? That rolling average for all the people measured for these metrics every day, every second of every day for a month is the same as going ahead and doing it for a whole year. And that's really important from an expense standpoint and to look at interventions. And when we look at different types of furniture interventions, if we want to make a furniture intervention and we want to see how it impacts folks, we can expect to start seeing changes in a reasonable short amount of time. And then once that number stabilizes, 30 days should be about what we're looking at. It shouldn't change much even after a year. Now, just for the information for the researchers on the line that are curious, all of the people that were in this study had their electric desks, the folks in the green bars, for more than a year before this study started. So they were all what we would consider kind of stable or steady state. They really weren't being affected by a very recent intervention. Take a look at this other information. It kind of follows. Average Keypresses also, about 20% or so different, anywhere from 20 to 30, even up to 40% for words typed in a day different. The typos were not statistically different from a statistical significance. They were not different. They were slightly different, but there's also a little bit higher rate or pace of typing that folks are doing at the stand-capable workstations. So that gives you a little bit of a feel about the productivity and kind of understanding how all of that works. So if you take a look at this 28 and 2 concept, this is something that Dr. Alan Hedge out of Cornell came up with. And what we wanted to do at Texas A&M was to try to understand, could we kind of quantify the effects of this? If we need to change about every 30 minutes, if we need to be doing something different, if we need to be moving throughout the workday, would it have an impact on cognition, either good or bad? Would it be something that people could keep up with and remember and be a nice routine? It seems like folks can kind of remember this concept for 30 minutes. And then is this general idea of a routine interruption, is it something that we need, whether it's through the computer or some other means? Is it positive? So we took folks and put them into a laboratory setting for 2.5 hours, and we ran them through the 28 and 2 repeatedly, and then of course we ran the same people through seated the whole 2.5 hours, and we did multiple tests throughout. They had wearable sensors, we did cognitive testing, we ran information on all their key metrics that we just discussed, the keystrokes and output. We did typing tests for accuracy and speed, and at the end of all of that, the 28 and 2 folks performed better. Their cognition was slightly higher, but not statistically different. And you have to kind of keep in mind that that's sort of good, because what we don't want to do is have something that we're trying to put in place in the workforce for health, and then it affects cognition or productivity or output. So the good news is no negative impact on any of these metrics. They did, of course, as you would expect, burn more calories, especially during the 2 minutes of walking on a treadmill. Very slow pace, but they were significantly more calories burned, both statistically and clinically. It might even allow us to have one more small piece of cake, or I think maybe a half a cupcake or something at the end of the day if we were doing the 28 and 2 instead of just sitting all day. So the other piece of this I think that's important, and why we need to continue this research over not just an 8-hour workday, but with more folks in the workforce, kind of in situ, and then over a year or more, is that we did see trends as you got closer to the 2.5 hour mark. the difference between the 28 and 2 folks and the seated folks got bigger. So up front, early, whether you were sitting for an hour or whether you were doing the 28 and 2 for an hour, it were pretty similar results. But when you started getting out to the 2 hour and especially the 2.5 hour mark, then we really started seeing the folks who were breaking up their sedentary behavior outperforming and kind of leaving. And by the way, that would be their own data. They were their own comparators in this case, so within subjects comparison. So very exciting. We're happy to see this, and we're happy to see that hopefully we'll encourage some other folks to do more work on this area. Okay, another area that we need to do is we need to work with employees themselves and help them understand how to listen to their body and understand that when they're getting some of those aches and pains, that we need to encourage them to move and change. It's a cultural issue. It's a management issue. It's something that we can help lead and prompt as health and safety professionals, as ergonomists, and we want to encourage employees to be break compliant. So we took 13,000 workers over multiple locations, multiple years of data, and we looked at who was break compliant with the software that was provided to give them nudges to take a break from their computer work. What we found was noteworthy. I found it really exciting because the folks who were break compliant were more productive. They had those higher metrics for keystrokes and output productivity that we measure with the mouse and the keyboard. So taking a break, even a short one, a little micro break at the computer, at your desk, or to get up and stand up and look outside or walk around. We've told people this for years, but now we have really hard objective data that says, yes, the people who do that, who are break compliant, who utilize the breaks more often, they get benefit from it. They're more productive. And so that's really exciting for management, I think, to encourage them to utilize these types of mechanisms with their employees. They will get a benefit from it. So it's not just for the health. Those folks, by the way, are reporting less discomfort, but it's also for the productivity. And there was an objective data point that I talked about, the 120, but there was also some subjective data points, including questions about stress. And I'm sure most of you on the call realize that stress, depression, and anxiety are chronic issues in our workplace, particularly with our younger professionals. This has really become a huge issue. Suicide, unfortunately, is up 33% in the last decade. It's a really significant issue. So stress, depression, anxiety questions for the folks who were break compliant, who took the nudges or the prompts, they had lower self-reports of stress. So again, another positive, not just for physical health, but also mental health, which is so important in the workplace with our wellness discussions right now. The other thing to think about when you've got workers, it's critical that everyone have an understanding, all of the workforce have an understanding that there's not just a single posture with their one chair used in one way. They can release that mechanism and they can recline. They can make it into a rocking chair, or use one like the OM seating work seat that already rocks. They can have a declined sitting position. They can dial up any type of movement or change that will allow them to shift their weight, change their blood flow, get their heart rate going, and move. The other piece then we have to teach folks is that there's not just a sit or a stand, so it's not just one position versus the other. It's multiple seated versus multiple standing postures. So the multiple standing postures would be things like the obvious one, standing flat-footed on both feet. That's what most people think of. But then there's also leaning against something, whether it's leaning your abdomen against the desk or leaning your back against something that gives you a position you can lean against. Whether it's one foot up on a rail or a footrest. You could be propping or perching on a stool designed for that just kind of catches you, takes a little bit of the load off. Some of those, by the way, will also pivot and move and rock. And I would encourage use of all of those types of products, again, a variety throughout the course of the day and in multiple places around your workplace. So not just one type at your workstation. I have 3 different types in my office that I utilize throughout the day as people come in. And of course, they stand because I don't have chairs for any of the guests to sit, but that has more to do with my work productivity than their comfort. But anyway, so yes, lots of movement and activity is what we need to do. For future tech, where we're headed with all of this, I think it's an amazing time to be involved in this work. There's just so much happening right now. There's so much more sensing and monitoring and prompting. When I came into the ergonomics arena in the late 80s, for the most part, everything we did was take a clipboard and believe it or not, back then even an analog stopwatch, and we went out and we watched workers. We observed work. We studied work. Then we would try to change or alter or improve work. Today, the ability to sense and monitor is completely different. It's radically different. The ability to sense posture through video capture from a cell phone, the ability to sense and monitor information from a person's biomarkers and their vitals, incredible. So the change too is different, because what I would do 30 years ago is I would go out with that clipboard and I would watch a couple of workers that I had pre-selected or begged to be a participant, and I would take those 2 workers and I would say, okay, those 2 workers represent the rest of the workforce or the other 20 people in the department. So I had to sample. I had to have a sampling routine. Today what's happening, what's changing is we don't have to sample anymore. We can take all of the workers. We can get 100%. We can get all of the data. So when you think about a sample mean versus a population mean, it's really exciting to know that we have the ability, using less cost, less money, cheaper, right, faster, and much higher level of information that we're getting from this through the type of monitoring that we're able to do today. It does bring up a little bit of Orwellian concerns, and I understand that. But I think for most workers, we recognize that when we come on campus, when we walk into our place of business, the majority of our privacy things, when it comes to electronics especially, are gone. And everything is being monitored, everything's being recorded, everything's being kept up with. And that's not to seem alarmist. It's just a reality in the culture that we live in, that data is being collected. And there will be lots of ethical discussions around this. Google's under one right now with some of their healthcare data that they're tracking. But I think in the end, most of us will be willing to give up information with some reasonable guarantee of security and privacy to gain back some of the positives for health and productivity and other outcomes. So it's an exciting time. Lots of things around recognition of us needing to change our own environment to meet our needs, to take ownership for that, right? To get comfortable, to change position, to request things that we need to fit us and be custom for us. So that's kind of a new era, as opposed to somebody coming out and noticing and then sort of pushing it out or forcing it on you. We're going to have a pull. That's going to be a big change the next decade, is we're going to have a pull from the workers. They're going to have the knowledge. They're going to have the information that really ergonomists like me 30 years ago, we didn't even have. They'll have more information, and it'll be better quality, and it'll be specific to them. The other thing that we're going to do is we're going to improve those measures of collaboration. We're going to improve measures of things like creativity and originality. How would a researcher like me go out and measure if your company's workforce was more creative after an intervention, had more original thoughts, was more collaborative? Right now we have some, I would call them lower level subjective tools to do these types of things. In the future, those tools are going to get really good, and they're really going to make a difference in the ergonomic arena and the types of research that we do. Another area that we need to look at is some of the other things that are happening with home and remote workers. And this is a big trend. We're seeing more and more folks switch to some amount or all work from a remote location or a home. We're seeing shared locations, but we're also, of course, seeing folks in their home office. And these other things that happen as a result of this is we embrace more casual spaces, things that look like your living room. Different types of furnishings are in need to be developed, and I think they will continue. They're catching on already, but I think they'll continue to catch on more. Folks want to be comfortable where they work. They're much more mobile, and the devices that we use are much smarter. And so that's really having an impact on design, particularly for the office environment. The other piece of this is now we have the ability to do very long-term longitudinal studies, and we can see the effect of these changes, multiple changes usually, on the health outcomes, but over a long period of time. So most of these questions that we really want to know about longevity and development of cardiovascular disease and development of type 2 diabetes as an aging workforce, we really need years to determine if the things we're doing today are changing those outcomes. There are signs and signals along the way, but unfortunately the best measure will be these longitudinal studies, and we're finally getting to a point now where we can take the type of data that we need to have that very accurate measure of those long-term outputs. Another thing that's happening right now, and I think it's super exciting, is that technology has enabled us to work just about from any place. But if you think about it, again, about a quarter of the workforce in the U.S., they're working from home already. This is already a trend. Now, we've seen some mixed results with this. One of the first studies that was done on this was kind of a bust years ago. They had come out with a way to have a break from everybody traveling to work in a very busy U.S. city. So they said, okay, can some of the workforce take Tuesday and Thursday, and some of the workforce take Monday and Wednesday and work from home? This will be great because what they were concerned about was pollution. Cars on the road, emitting pollution, everybody driving to work, driving back home. So it was a big concern. So they got everybody on board. It was a big public announcement. They got all the companies to get on board, big push. When they went back 3 years later and studied it, the people who were working from home on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday and Thursday, they drove more miles than they did when they drove to work. And one of the things that happened was they could avoid rush hour. So suddenly the ability to have the freedom and the flexibility to run out to the store at 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning, instead of trying to fight traffic after 5 and then stop by the store then when everyone's tired, they actually increased their miles. So we have to be careful sometimes with what we think will be the outcome. So one of the things we thought would be the outcome from people moving from the work arena to the home arena was that they would become more sedentary. I mean, let's face it, for most of us in our homes, it's 10 feet to the restroom, it's 10 feet to the kitchen, it's 10 feet to the living room, and we're doing our work at our dining room table or our kitchen. Not a lot of ambulation, not a lot of movement. And so how do you get folks to move more in the home? Well, we started taking a look at that, and we thought going in, our theory, kind of similar to the mileage theory, was that folks would walk a lot less. They would sit and be sedentary a lot more in their homes, and they just wouldn't move as much as somebody who, drove to work, parked in the back of the parking lot, walked across the campus, went upstairs to their office, went all around the building and the campus to multiple meetings throughout the day, went out for lunch, came back in. We just really thought those folks were going to have so many more steps in the course of a day, and they would have so much more physical activity. But as with so many things, that wasn't what happened. That wasn't how it turned out. So if you take a look at this graphic, and I apologize, I know this one's a little bit busier than the others, but whether you were in the office, the traditional office, or you were at home, you ended up in breaking down just an hour, so 60 minutes. You spent about the same number of minutes sitting, standing, stepping. It didn't really change. It really wasn't a big effect. Now you could say yay or good, except here's the rest of the story. Neither of these is good, right? So the amount of steps would be considered very low, way below what any national guideline would recommend for somebody to get in during the day. And the amount of time that we spend sitting is still too much. It's still too significant. So we've got to figure out a way, not just for our traditional office workers, but also our home office workers to get more movement. It's really both of them that we need to target for this. Little piece just real quick, I wanted to touch on this, and I'll leave it for the Q&A session as well, because we're getting close to our time. But if you look at the standards out there right now, some of the most critical ones, I think, that are being updated in this arena would be the ANSI HFES 100 and also the ANSI BIFMA G1, both ergonomic standards around computers and workstations and furniture, even the products that you use at the computer, like the keyboards and the mice and things. Those standards are getting some updates. They're getting some updates with lingo that I mentioned today, like the sit, the stand, the perch, the lean, the prop. You're seeing some information in there about foot supports for the standing workstations that haven't been there in the past. It's very exciting. I think it's great that we're doing that. I would say that the next sort of trend that we're looking for kind of in the standards arena would be that the standards will move from this sort of static, imagine downloading a PDF with a bunch of words written on it that say thou shalt and thou should and there, maybe you should or could or whatever, to something that's more custom, to where you would put on a pair of virtual reality glasses and you would step into an environment and you would go through that environment and you could try on or try out or test fit in that environment things. You could put your products into that environment to see if they met the standard or passed the standard or fit whatever the standard was. And so again, that custom level for whether it's a product check to look at a piece of furniture that's being designed, or on the human side as a consumer to see if something's going to work for you, we're going to have that ability to sort of step into that PDF instead. And so that'll be very exciting. The other piece of this is to look at the last part there on dimensions. So when you think of chairs and work surfaces, we really have done a good job now of bringing all of these standards up to speed on some of the latest civilian anthropometry data. But also now there's some information out there, and I hope some of you will be attending some of the conferences coming up over the next year where there'll be presentations on things like the virtual fit test. And you can go and you can sit for hopefully 45 minutes or so, kind of like this webinar, and learn just about the anthropometry or the virtual fit test method of how things can be designed to fit rather than just a type of person or a particular level of person, like a 5th percentile female. We can look at what multiple people and multiple cases would look like in that new furniture or using that new mouse or whatever it happens to be that we're designing for. Last piece here, and then we'll wrap up for questions. We know that the kind of the big change, the big area that we're headed in for the work arena is data, lots and lots and lots of data. I mentioned before kind of the ability to go from understanding a sample mean to understanding the population mean, and that's really exciting. We hope that through all of this technology, really because technology-induced inactivity was such a big part of the last 40 years of what sort of ailed us, we hope that technology will now become the cure. It will become our friend. It will be our companion, our coach. It will be there for us to help nudge us and cause some of these healthy behaviors that we all need. So really exciting. And the other piece of this is aggregating all of the different sources of information, whether they're from a wearable, whether they're from a watch or a smartphone, whether they're from the desktop PC or laptop or tablet, whether they're from an airport or an office speaker or a telephone that we use while we're in the office or in our home. Aggregating all of the information that comes from all of those sources to kind of bring to bear to help us to be healthier and more productive is really an exciting time. Lots of work in this area coming up. You'll see some really fun stuff coming out over the next 3 to 5 years. The other piece of it is just broadening our focus as folks who deal with the workplace. We talk about this throughout today's discussion, the work arena. We really need to go beyond that now and start considering not just the workstation or the building, but we need to go past the building and look at that built environment, the community around it. And then, of course, finally, we need to think 24/7. The last piece I'll leave with you is an old Latin saying, solvitur ambulando. Solvitur ambulando basically means I can solve all my problems with a walk. And so I would encourage you to do that. And you probably need to take a walk now after our webinar. But I hope a few of you have some questions. Thanks again for having me today. It's been great.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benden, for that information. We do have some questions. And one of the first questions that always comes up is how can I review this information? There were so many good charts, and I'd like to be able to see it some more. So do note that this webinar will be recorded and it will be posted in about a week at ergoexpo.com in the webinars section. So you'll be able to pause, make notes, or take any of those notes that you might have missed while we were on the presentation. You don't want to be able to miss that. So with that, we do have a couple of questions. One of the questions, or actually a couple of questions, focused on something you mentioned about designing buildings and workspaces for space and movement. Could you expound on that a little bit and tell us what some of those thoughts might be around how someone would design that or what those would look like?
Sure. So some really simple things that we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years with building design. If you walk into a building lobby, for instance, and you're welcomed by a bay of 6 elevators, whether you're going to the 2nd floor or the 3rd floor or the 4th, it doesn't really matter. You're taking the elevator, right? It's kind of a design paradigm that sets you up for what I would consider failure by not taking the stairs. So if you walk into another building and the lobby has a really grand, beautiful, wide open, spiraling staircase that gets you up to the 2nd or 3rd level, and from there you can go into other staircases that are well lit and open, that changes your paradigm about how you're going to get to the next place or the next meeting or the next movement in that building. The same type of thing would be whether you bury the fitness facility down in the basement in the back corner where no one ever goes except for the 2 or 3 folks that are really into CrossFit maybe, or you put it up front, you put it in glass, and when everyone walks in, you're like in a fishbowl, and you got to go by that. And every day you see it coming and going, and it's a reminder, that easy mnemonic that says I should stop in there and utilize those facilities that the company's providing. Healthy choices, in a cafeteria space. How you lay out the food for what you would encourage people to select or choose first has a lot to do with how you design the space and where you present the most healthy choices and what types of things you do to present that. So we can make it, whether it's nutrition or physical activity or things at the workstation. When you boil it down to the workstation level, it could be something as simple as I walk into the work environment, I get to my floor, I get to my area where my desk is going to be. I may even have to choose a desk depending on the company, but before I get there, there's a common area, and there's a kitchen area, and there's a seating area that looks like a living room. And I can stop in any of those, and I can have a conversation, whether I'm lounging or sitting or standing, before I even get to what would be considered my primary workstation. So I may conduct an hour or 2 of business before I really get to that landing zone. That landing zone could be open or closed. It could be some of the pods now are getting very popular. I think they're coming back in popularity. They're a little different from a cubicle, but I think they're coming back because we need to save on space. We can't have a ton of space for everybody. We can't have a giant office for everyone, but we do need a spot where we can have a little privacy, visual and auditory. Particularly in the U.S., our culture, that's a really big deal for us. And so we've kind of rebounded back from that, and we're giving people more of those kind of privacy and pod type options.
Great, thank you for that. We had a number of questions that focused around the idea of prompting. So you mentioned prompting earlier. Could you give us a little bit more information on what that looked like, how it was done in your study?
So we used 3 different studies. We used 3 different softwares. We used the Ergonomics, we used the Inventions, and we also used the Sit-Stand Coach. And I can confidently recommend any of those products. They all worked well. The companies were great. It's a really big challenge to go into a corporation and say, hi, we're here from Texas A&M, and we want to install a software on your computer. That's a year's worth of work from that moment, that conversation, to where you're collecting data at a minimum. And that's because you've got to go through IT, you've got to go through legal, and I don't know, just anybody else that they throw up, the security guard. I mean, it's crazy. But these companies were great. They helped us through that process because they had done it. And then, the good news is when you get to that final point, all of those softwares provide custom options for prompting. You can set up options for prompting. You can help program options. People can opt out. They can choose none or some. They can choose, every 20 minutes or every hour. There's lots of different things and benefits to these softwares, but the flexibility for all of them was fantastic. And what I found was that whether you used it a lot or a little, it still helped compared to not using it at all. So again, it's an easy recommendation for me as an ergonomist that whichever brand or company or product you choose, choose one and use it. They're all helpful.
Great, thank you. For anyone whose questions do not get answered today, the speaker will be given a list of all the questions with your contact information, so they will be able to reach out to you directly. But Dr. Benden, is there an email address? It's not on the slide, but is there a contact information you'd like to give out as part of this presentation so that someone can reach out to you with specific questions later on?
Sure, they could just use my markbenden@gmail.com.
Great, thank you. We do have some more questions. One of them is about the introduction of a lot of accessories for standing workstations, mats, different pieces of equipment that might be included with a standing workstation. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that? Sure.
We did ask people for their thoughts on these things. One of the studies that I didn't have time to go through today was a 11-year follow-up where we've been following people using sit-stand and stand-biased workstations now for 11 years. And things like footrests were huge. Mats for the people who stand, especially the people who I would consider sort of on the extreme, they stand a lot or they stand more of the workday than they sit, so over half. They really preferred to have some sort of a mat present. That's, you know, just one of those small items that can make a difference in comfort throughout the day.
Thank you. There's some questions around when standing postures turn into leaning postures, leaning on desks, leaning on cafe height tables, leaning on walls. Can you talk a little bit about how leaning factors in? Is that something we want to look at? Is it something that indicates a fatigue level? Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, it's absolutely an indication of fatigue, and that's why we recommend it, right? Because it's a way to offload the large skeletal trunk muscles that hold us upright. It gives them a break. It's the same when you put one foot up on a foot rail. You've got half of your, large trunk muscles that keep you upright, relaxing and replenishing. And, that restorative aspect keeps you from building up sort of the negative part of fatigue. And there of course, are negatives to standing too much. We don't recommend people stand all day, of course. We recommend that they change positions between sitting and standing and then those multiple postures in between. But leaning is a good indication that they're fatiguing. Something's getting tired, whether it's their calf muscles, their low back, their ankles. A lot of times in older folks, we're finding their hips. They need to take a load off. And so having products available that are sturdy and solid and built for this, and there's some interesting leaning products now on the market that have a floor built in. So when you lean back, your feet are on that false floor that's part of the product, and that keeps it from tipping or tilting. I think all of those are great and should be available to people to utilize throughout the day.
Great, thank you. Mark, would you mind stating your email address one more time, perhaps a little more slowly?
Sure, it's just Mark, M-A-R-K, Benden, B-E-N-D-E-N, @gmail.com.
Great, thank you so much. I'm sure our attendees are going to appreciate that. You briefly touched on some of the standards that are potentially being updated, addressing workplace seating. Could you perhaps go over those again or talk a little bit more about? I know a lot of them have committees. Is this something people could participate in?
So the ANSI HFES 100, the Computer Workstation Standard, and then also the ANSI BIFMA G1 Ergonomic Standard, both will have some periods of comment. Some of those will be restricted to certain people or certain representatives. Some of them will be open to the public for comment. And so if you'll just keep an eye out through your different ergonomic channels, LinkedIn especially, you'll see it through the different groups that are connected to ergonomics there. You'll see announcements come out, and you can certainly go in and review those and provide comment. I would encourage everyone to do that, particularly folks who have any kind of impact on purchasing for their users or design for products at their company. Be sure you're a part of that conversation, because those standards typically they might last a decade. And so if you're doing something new or exciting, or you want something to be included, now's definitely the time on both of those.
Fantastic, thank you. We have a couple of questions that center around the idea of if you're coming into an organization or an area and they really haven't addressed any of these features, not the overall workplace design, not the movement, not the placement of the cafeteria, and possibly not the accessories at the workstation, where do you recommend someone start?
Great question. Well, I've always found that the easiest conversations are the ones that don't result in a lot of price tag attached to it. That tends to be the most straightforward. So I would say whatever could result in the most obvious change, biggest upfront change or impact at the lowest cost would be the one that I would try to get going first, because you need some of those victories in a location like you're talking about to make sure that you have a chance to kind of fight some of the bigger battles. If you start off with just the really big battles, it just might be a hard pass or a hard no or a not now. But if you start with some of the smaller ones and you get some folks enlisted and you start building that culture, that's going to be your best chance.
Great, thank you so much. Moving from the workplace a little bit, you mentioned classrooms in an earlier slide, and we have a question around if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about how you feel this information would apply in a classroom setting.
Yeah, so it's exciting to see, again, the children and the teachers embracing these concepts of movement. We've had for years now an idea that, you kind of sit down, sit still, be quiet, don't move. And that we have found as we've studied objectively with wearable sensors and even FNIRS, functional near-infrared spectroscopy. It's a brain imaging technique in the classroom. What we have found is that there's only about 1/3 to 50% of the children in school who really can follow that mantra well, especially the younger ones, right? So less than half of the kids can really sit down, sit still, be quiet, don't move. And for the majority of children, and certainly all the rest of them, they just can't do that. And so the question for us, I think, as adults and as educators is, why would we try? Why would we try to force someone to learn in a way that they're not good at? Many of us as adults, we know that we're, for instance, auditory or we're visual learners. Some of us are very kinesthetic. We need to do hands-on. Well, children are the same way. But again, more than half of the children, they just can't sit still and be quiet and just focus and be attentive and not be a distraction to their neighbors, which is really where the teachers notice the difference on their classroom management. It's critical that we introduce this ability to move in the classroom and allow kids to kind of find their sweet spot for learning rather than being forced into something that they struggle with.
Great, thank you so much. That's going to wrap up our webinar today. Thank you again, Dr. Benden, for your valuable insights today. If you want to learn more about the issues and solutions we discussed here today, you need to be at the National Ergonomics Conference and Ergo Expo next August in Las Vegas. I have one more final thank you, and that's to all of you. Thank you for joining us today as we all work toward creating safer and more productive work environments. That concludes our webinar presentation.